I'd been on the road for hours, and every mile marker felt heavier, pressing down on my eyes. The hum of the highway mixed with the droning static from the old radio, and I knew I needed to rest before continuing. There was a faded sign on the side of the road, Briarwood Motel, 2 miles ahead. It looked abandoned, but at that moment I didn't care. I just needed a bed. As I pulled into the empty lot, a sinking feeling spread through me. The motel sat in the middle of nowhere, an old, decrepit structure, shrouded in shadows. Only a single neon light flickered, buzzing faintly in the misty night air. The lobby was dusty, cluttered with ancient furniture that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A man sat behind the counter, his eyes distant and dark. He didn't say much, just handed me the key with a forced smile that barely moved his face. "Room 12, end of the hall," he muttered, his voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. The room looked as if it had been frozen in time since the 70s. The carpet was a dull orange, stained and threadbare in places. The bedspread was covered in a floral pattern that had faded to near obscurity. The air was thick with a musty odor, mixed with something metallic that I couldn't identify. As I set down my bag, I felt the chill of the room settle in my bones. I locked the door, double-checking, and pulled the curtains tightly shut. I turned off the light, letting the dim glow of the street lamp outside cast an eerie hue across the room. I lay there in silence, waiting for sleep to overtake me. Then, I heard it. Thump. I froze, every nerve alert. Thump, thump. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoed down the hallway, stopping right outside my door. My heartbeat quickened, and I strained to listen, holding my breath. Silence. I convinced myself it was probably just the night manager doing his rounds, but something felt wrong. As I tried to drift off again, I heard the faintest creak in the room. My eyes snapped open, and I saw a shadow by the window. I bolted upright, switching on the bedside lamp. Nothing. The window was locked, and the curtains hadn't moved. Get a grip, I thought, forcing myself to lie back down. I closed my eyes, determined to sleep. Then came a whisper, a low, guttural sound like someone gasping for air, right by my ear. My eyes shot open again, and I could swear I felt the breath on my cheek, cold and damp. "Leave." The voice was barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. My heart pounded as I glanced around the room, searching for the source of the sound. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room, morphing and flickering. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But then, the bed dipped, as if someone had just sat down beside me. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to look, expecting to see nothing. But there, on the edge of the bed, was a faint figure. Transparent, almost like a mirage, but unmistakably human. A woman, her eyes wide, staring at something in the distance. She didn't notice me. Or if she did, she didn't care. Her mouth moved, mouthing words I couldn't understand. Her expression frozen in fear. She was looking toward the door, as if something terrible lurked just outside. A chill crept down my spine and I whispered, "Who are you?" She turned just slightly and met my eyes. Her face was a mask of despair, and her lips parted as if she were trying to speak. But no sound came out. Instead, she pointed to the door. "Leave!" Her voice rasped, almost a plea. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. The lights began to flicker erratically, and a low growling sound filled the room, seeming to emanate from every corner. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my bag and fumbling for the door. As I yanked it open, I felt an ice-cold hand graze my shoulder. I whipped around to see the woman standing inches away, her eyes wide with terror, as if begging me to escape. Without thinking, I bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I turned, panting, half expecting to see her face pressed against the window. But there was only darkness, the faint glow of the street lamp casting eerie shadows. I rushed to the front desk, but the night manager was gone. There was only a faint whiff of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. I rang the bell on the counter, but no one came. In desperation, I ran back outside to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I got in, I glanced back at the motel. In the window of room 12, the woman was standing watching me, her face illuminated by an otherworldly light. Just as I started the car, she raised a hand, her mouth forming one final word: "Beware." I didn't wait to see what happened next. I sped out of the parking lot, heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I finally pulled over, I couldn't shake the image of her face, her haunted eyes pleading with me. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, maybe a vivid nightmare. But when I checked the rearview mirror, I saw the faint outline of a handprint on my shoulder, bruised and cold. It was a typical night shift at Briar Pines Medical Center, one of those old hospitals with flickering lights and endless winding corridors that seemed to stretch into nothingness. It was my first week as an overnight security guard. The pay was decent, but the hours were long, and the eerie silence only added to the unsettling atmosphere. The hospital had 3 main floors, an abandoned wing, and a basement that stored old medical equipment. But there was a rule: no one was allowed in the basement after midnight. The staff had warned me about strange occurrences on the night shift. They spoke of whispers in empty rooms, equipment turning on by itself, and shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. I laughed it off at first. After all, hospitals are full of sick people. Strange noises were probably normal. But as the week went on, I began to understand why no one lasted long on the night shift. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night when things began to feel different. I was making my rounds, flashlight in hand, walking down the dimly lit hallway of the abandoned wing. I had never been particularly superstitious, but the eerie quiet of that hallway made me feel watched. I paused outside room 203, where I thought I'd heard a faint scratching noise. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Just the echo of my own breathing and the buzz of a faulty light overhead. Shaking my head, I moved on, convincing myself it was just the building settling. But as I turned the corner, a shadow darted at the edge of my vision. I whipped around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened as I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just jumpy. But that's when I heard it. A low, raspy voice coming from behind me. "Come back." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded like it came from a patient room, but these rooms had been empty for years. With a mix of fear and curiosity, I slowly turned, shining my flashlight down the hallway. At the end of the corridor, I saw a figure, a tall, dark silhouette standing perfectly still, watching me. It looked like a person, but something was off. The figure was too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I called out, though my voice shook. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. I took a cautious step forward, my heart pounding, but as I approached, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, like smoke dissipating in the wind. I stood there breathing heavily, trying to steady my nerves. I decided to radio the security office to see if anyone else was on the floor. But as I reached for my walkie-talkie, it emitted a burst of static, followed by a faint whisper. "Don't. Come. Down." I felt a chill race up my spine as I glanced around, seeing nothing but empty rooms and flickering lights. My training told me to finish my rounds, but my gut told me to get out. Still, I forced myself to continue, moving down the corridor and toward the central stairwell. The stairwell led to the basement, the one place in the hospital that no one was supposed to go after midnight. But as I descended the stairs, drawn by some inexplicable urge, I felt a suffocating heaviness settle around me. Each step echoed in the silence, and the air grew colder with every descent. At the bottom of the stairs, a single dim light bulb flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The basement was cluttered with old equipment, dusty hospital beds, and shelves lined with empty medical jars. I should have turned back, but something, an instinct, a compulsion, drew me forward. As I rounded a corner, I saw it, a door with peeling paint marked morgue. I'd never been told about a morgue in the basement. The hospital hadn't had an active morgue for years, yet here it was, hidden away and forgotten. My heart raced as I approached the door, feeling an intense, inexplicable pull. I pushed it open, the door creaking as it swung into a dark, cold room. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and decay, mixed with the faint scent of bleach. I raised my flashlight, and the beam illuminated rows of metal drawers, each marked with a faded label. Some were scratched out, unreadable. Suddenly, I felt something cold brush against my arm and I jerked, swinging my flashlight around. There was no one there, but then I saw it, a shadow moving along the far wall, slipping between the drawers. "Who's there?" My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The shadow moved again, closer this time, shifting and stretching until it took the shape of the figure I'd seen in the hallway. Its head tilted, just as before, and it seemed to grin, a twisted, unnatural smile that stretched too wide. "Come, closer," the voice rasped, filling the room with an eerie echo. I backed away, my heart pounding as the shadowy figure began to advance. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered wildly. Desperately, I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me in the darkness. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, screaming for help. But the only response was the figure's slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer. Then a hand, cold, clammy, and inhumanly strong, wrapped around my wrist, pulling me backward. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but it was no use. The figure's grip was unbreakable, and it was dragging me toward one of the empty drawers. "No!" I screamed, but the figure only laughed, a chilling, hollow sound that echoed in my ears. It opened the drawer, and with a sickening sense of dread, I realized its intention. It was going to lock me inside. I struggled harder, but the figure's strength was overwhelming. It shoved me into the drawer, and I felt the cold metal press against my back as the door slammed shut, sealing me in. Darkness enveloped me, and I struggled to breathe, gasping for air in the suffocating, confined space. I pounded on the door, screaming, but my voice was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. Then, just as my vision began to blur, I heard it. A faint voice, distant and echoing, like a whisper from beyond. "Welcome to the night shift." I'd been a night shift operator at a small, rural emergency call center for about a year. Most nights were quiet, especially after midnight. The usual calls were minor: domestic disputes, noise complaints, and the occasional call from someone stranded on the highway. It wasn't the job I'd dreamed of, but it paid the bills. One cold November night, as the clock neared 2 a.m., I was alone in the dispatch room, my eyes growing heavy from the monotony. I was just about to pour my third cup of coffee when the phone rang. The number was unlisted, and my screen showed only a blank caller ID. This was unusual, but not impossible. I pressed the receiver to my ear. 911, what's your emergency? For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard something, a faint, raspy breathing on the other end. It felt as if someone were right there, struggling to speak. "Hello?" I tried again, straining to hear. A voice came through, whispering, barely audible. "Help! Me!" The voice was weak and trembled with fear. I leaned in closer, trying to catch every word. "Sir, are you in danger? Can you tell me where you are?" "Please, they're here. Watching." The voice choked out, each word a struggle. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you give me your location?" For a few seconds, there was only silence, and then, in that same strained whisper, he murmured, "They're coming." My heart began to pound. I glanced around the empty dispatch room, feeling a chill seep into my bones. Who's coming? Can you describe them? The voice faded, like someone slipping away into the dark. Then, barely a whisper, "They are everywhere." And then the line went dead. I checked the call log, but it offered no answers, no number, no trace. My mind raced with questions, but without any details. I was powerless. I shook it off, assuming it was a prank or someone playing with a voice changer app. But just as I was beginning to relax, the phone rang again. It was the same blank caller ID. A sense of dread washed over me, but I forced myself to answer. 911, what's your emergency? This time, there was no whisper. Instead, I heard faint music, an old song playing, distorted and eerie. It sounded like a record being played too slowly. In the background, a clock ticked, each tick stretching out longer than the last. I felt my pulse quicken as the music grew louder, almost deafening. Hello? Is anyone there? The music stopped, and for a few seconds, there was nothing but the eerie tick-tock. And then, in that same chilling whisper, the voice returned. They're inside. My blood turned cold. Inside? Inside where? Are you talking about your house? They're inside. The room. I froze. For a moment, I didn't dare to breathe. What room? I managed to ask, barely finding my voice. Silence. And then a whisper. One word that sent shivers down my spine. Yours. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, staring into the empty dispatch room. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I scanned every corner, every shadow, but saw nothing unusual. But just as I was about to relax, the lights in the dispatch room flickered. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim room as I searched frantically. I was alone, or so I thought. The phone rang again, the same number, unlisted, no caller ID. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? This time, the voice was clearer. It was calm, almost amused. I can see you. I looked around, panic rising. Who are you? What do you want? Look behind you, the voice whispered. I turned, holding my breath, but there was only empty space. My heart was racing as I tried to steady myself. I slammed the phone down, ending the call. But before I could catch my breath, it rang again. Same number. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I picked up. This time I was greeted by silence. Then, slowly, a low, guttural laugh filled the line, a sound that chilled me to my core. Stop calling here, I said, trying to sound brave, but my voice shook. The laughter stopped, replaced by that familiar whisper. This is only the beginning. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, expecting it to ring again, but it remained silent. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself it was just someone playing a twisted prank. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. As the hours dragged on, I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept drifting back to those calls. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, I packed up my things, eager to get home and put the night behind me. But as I was about to leave, the phone rang one last time. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. 911, what's your emergency? There was no whisper, no eerie music, just silence. And then, in a voice that sounded almost relieved, the caller said, I'm here now. My stomach dropped. I asked, where? But there was no response. The line went dead, and this time it stayed that way. Growing up, our family heirloom was a massive, ornate mirror that had been passed down through generations. It stood over 6 feet tall, framed with intricate carvings of vines and flowers, with some parts chipped and cracked, revealing how old it really was. I'd heard stories about it from my grandmother, tales of it being a family protector, watching over us silently. But her smile was never quite genuine when she said it, and her eyes always seemed to drift elsewhere, as if remembering something dark. My mom finally inherited the mirror when my grandmother passed. She decided to place it in our hallway, right across from my bedroom. From the moment it arrived, it felt out of place, as though it had brought with it a shadow that made the air heavier, colder. I'd often catch myself avoiding looking directly at it, yet at the same time, I found myself inexplicably drawn to it, as if it were calling to me. One night when I couldn't sleep, I wandered out of my room and found myself standing before the mirror. I expected to see my own reflection looking back, bleary-eyed and exhausted. But instead, something strange happened. My reflection seemed different. Its expression was blank, and its eyes looked far too dark, almost as though they were pools of ink. I blinked, and for a second, it looked like it had blinked after I did. But I brushed it off as a trick of the light, turned, and went back to bed. The following nights it happened again and again. My reflection seemed to lag, its face gradually taking on a more hollow, almost sinister appearance. I mentioned it to my mom, but she just laughed, saying it was likely due to my lack of sleep and the dim hallway lighting. Yet, deep down, I felt there was something else. One night, after waking from a particularly disturbing nightmare, I decided to face the mirror once more. This time, I approached it with a determination I hadn't felt before. I walked up to it, studying my reflection carefully. The figure in the mirror was me, but at the same time, it wasn't. Its mouth was slightly open, its eyes looked darker than I remembered, and there was a strange glint of malice in them. I stared, feeling my heart hammering against my chest, and then, to my horror, my reflection smiled. It was a slow, twisted grin that didn't reach the eyes. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but my reflection stayed put, grinning back at me with that disturbing smile. "Who are you?" I whispered, almost afraid to hear an answer. The reflection's lips moved, mimicking my words, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but something rooted me in place. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, I found myself looking through my reflection. The hallway behind me was gone. Instead, there was only darkness, an endless black void that stretched into eternity. And then, out of that darkness, something began to move. I strained to see what it was, and slowly, figures began to emerge. They were faint at first, hazy silhouettes. But as they approached, I could see that they were people. Or at least, they had been people once. Their faces were gaunt, eyes empty, and mouths hanging open as if locked in silent screams. The mirror felt like it was sucking me in, pulling me toward the darkness. I stumbled back, breaking the spell, and the figures vanished. But just as I thought I was free, my reflection leaned forward, placing a hand on the other side of the glass. It wasn't a perfect mirror image. It was as though something else was mimicking me. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice barely audible but dripping with desperation and malice. I backed away, my heart pounding. The reflection continued to stare, its face twisting into a look of fury as I stepped further back. And then, with a force that rattled the entire house, the mirror cracked. A jagged line appeared right down the middle, and for a split second, I thought I saw my reflection's hand reach through, fingers pressing against the broken glass. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I told my mom what had happened. She was horrified at the sight of the cracked mirror and had it removed immediately, thinking it was just an unfortunate accident. But I knew better. I'd seen the thing in the mirror. It wasn't me, and it wanted out. The mirror was taken to the attic and covered with an old sheet, but I could still feel it up there. Every creak, every rustle in the night seemed to remind me that it was watching, waiting. Several nights later, I was woken by a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the attic, from behind the thick wooden door that led up to where the mirror now lay. "Let me out." Those same words, over and over, echoing through the silence. I lay there, paralyzed, clutching my blanket as the whispers continued, pleading, sometimes laughing softly, mocking me. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The whispers grew louder at night, almost unbearable, filling my mind with images of the hollow-eyed figures from the mirror. My parents couldn't hear it, and when I tried to explain, they brushed it off as a nightmare. Finally, one night, the whispering stopped. The silence was almost worse, stretching on for hours as I lay awake, expecting to hear it at any moment. But there was nothing. For the first time in weeks, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. But that morning, as I went downstairs, I froze. The mirror was there, back in the hallway, its cracked surface glinting in the dim light. I stumbled back, calling for my parents, but when they came, they insisted they hadn't moved it. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I told my mom what had happened. She was horrified at the sight of the cracked mirror and had it removed immediately, thinking it was just an unfortunate accident. But I knew better. I'd seen the thing in the mirror. It wasn't me, and it wanted out. The mirror was taken to the attic and covered with an old sheet, but I could still feel it up there. Every creak, every rustle in the night seemed to remind me that it was watching, waiting. Several nights later, I was woken by a soft whisper. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I lay there, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the attic, from behind the thick wooden door that led up to where the mirror now lay. "Let me out." Those same words over and over, echoing through the silence. I lay there, paralyzed, clutching my blanket as the whispers continued, pleading, sometimes laughing softly, mocking me. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The whispers grew louder at night, almost unbearable, filling my mind with images of the hollow-eyed figures from the mirror. My parents couldn't hear it, and when I tried to explain, they brushed it off as a nightmare. Finally, one night, the whispering stopped. The silence was almost worse, stretching on for hours as I lay awake, expecting to hear it at any moment. But there was nothing. For the first time in weeks, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. But that morning, as I went downstairs, I froze. The mirror was there, back in the hallway, its cracked surface glinting in the dim light. I stumbled back, calling for my parents, but when they came, they insisted they hadn't moved it. As I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach, I saw a new reflection looking back at me. This time it was me, but my eyes were hollow and dark, and a twisted smile stretched across my face. And then it whispered, my own voice turning against me. "Welcome back."